Do you remember the strange things your grandparents kept in their pantries? Items you would never see in grocery stores today? In the 1940s, rationing changed everything. Families learned to survive on foods most of us would not recognize now. Powdered eggs that tasted like chalk. Margarine that came with a dye packet you had to knead in by hand.
When it comes to the food I serve my family, only the best will do, especially the meat. That's why I shop at Lucky.
Coffee made from roasted barley that never tasted like coffee at all. These were not just products. They were lifelines during a war that touched every kitchen in America. Today, we are looking at 25 grocery items from the 1940s that disappeared with our grandparents. Items that tell the story of sacrifice, creativity, and a generation that knew how to make something from almost nothing. Stick with me, because some of these will shock you, and all of them will remind you just how much has changed. Victory, coffee substitute. Let's start with something that touched every morning in every home, Victory coffee substitute. Real coffee beans were scarce during World War II, rationed heavily, and saved for soldiers overseas, so families turned to something else. Roasted barley, chicory root, sometimes wheat, all ground into a dark powder and sold as coffee. It looked like coffee when you poured it into a cup. It steamed like coffee. But the taste? That was where the illusion fell apart. Picture your grandmother standing at the stove, brewing a pot of this substitute before sunrise. The smell was not rich or inviting. It was burnt, bitter, almost like scorched toast left too long in the oven. She poured it anyway, added a little milk if she had it, maybe a precious spoonful of sugar if the ration stamps allowed. And she drank it without complaint, because complaining would not bring real coffee back. Advertisements at the time tried to sell it as patriotic. Drinking Victory coffee meant you were doing your part for the war effort. Some ads even claimed it was healthier, easier on the nerves, better for families, but nobody believed that. They drank it because they had to, because the ritual of a morning cup mattered more than the taste. For many soldiers who came home after the war, that burnt flavor stayed in their memory. Some never touched coffee substitutes again. Others grew so used to it that real coffee tasted strange when it finally returned to shelves. Dried soup bricks. If Victory coffee was the morning compromise, dried soup bricks were the dinner solution. These compressed blocks of dehydrated vegetables, grains, and sometimes a little dried beef were sold as miracle products. Just drop one into boiling water and watch it dissolve into something that resembled soup. They were compact, lightweight, and could sit on a shelf for months without spoiling. For families struggling to stretch rations, they were practical magic. Picture the scene. Your grandmother pulls a brown brick from the cupboard, hard as a rock and about the size of a deck of cards. She drops it into a pot of water on the stove and waits. Slowly, it begins to break apart. Bits of carrot, peas, and celery emerge, floating in a broth that grows darker and thicker. The smell is not quite right, a little too salty, a little too processed. But it fills the kitchen with warmth. Children gathered around the table as she ladled it into bowls. The texture was mushy, the flavor flat, unless she added onions or potatoes from the Victory garden, but it was hot, it was filling, and it was dinner. Some families added leftover meat scraps or a handful of noodles to make it heartier. Others ate it plain, grateful for anything that could feed the whole family without using up precious ration stamps. The bricks came with patriotic names printed on the packaging. Victory soup, freedom broth, names designed to make families feel like eating them was an act of service. And in a way, it was. Every brick consumed meant more resources could go to soldiers fighting overseas, but nobody pretended they were delicious. They were survival food, plain and simple. Wartime oleomargarine with color capsule. Now here is something truly bizarre. Wartime oleomargarine with a color capsule. Butter was one of the most heavily rationed items during the 1940s. Dairy farms could not produce enough to meet demand, and what they did produce went to the military first, so margarine became the substitute. But there was a problem. Margarine was white, stark white, like lard. It looked nothing like butter. And nobody wanted to spread something that pale and unappetizing on their bread. The solution was strange. Companies started including a small capsule of red or yellow dye inside each package of margarine. Your grandmother would open the package, find the little capsule, and then knead it by hand, squeezing and folding the white block until the dye spread through and turned it golden yellow. It was messy, time-consuming, and oddly satisfying. Children loved helping, watching the streaks of color swirl through the white until it finally looked like butter. But here is the twist. In some states, it was actually illegal for companies to sell margarine already colored. Dairy lobbies had fought hard to protect the butter industry, and laws were passed to make margarine less appealing. So families had to do the work themselves, kneading that dye packet in their own kitchens, turning a plain white block into something that at least looked like the real thing. The taste was never quite right. Margarine had a greasy, artificial quality that butter did not. It melted differently, spread differently, and left a film on the roof of your mouth. But it was cheaper, and during rationing, cheaper mattered more than flavor. Families used it on toast, in baking, and for frying, pretending it was butter even when they knew better. Jellied chicken loaf. If you think margarine with dye packets was strange, wait until you hear about jellied chicken loaf. This was canned chicken, real chicken, suspended in gelatin and sold as a luxury item. During wartime rationing, any form of meat was considered precious. So when companies started canning chicken in aspic, families bought it, even if the idea seemed bizarre. Picture opening a can and seeing what slides out. A loaf-shaped block of clear gelatin with chunks of pale chicken visible inside, like specimens preserved in amber. The gelatin jiggled when you touched it, cold and slippery. Your grandmother would slice it carefully, serving it on toast or crackers, sometimes with a little mustard or pickle relish, to mask the strange texture. The taste was not terrible, but the texture was unsettling. The chicken itself was tender enough, shredded and pressed into the mold, but the gelatin had no flavor, just a slick, wobbly presence that made every bite feel slightly wrong. Children stared at it suspiciously, poking it with forks and watching it quiver. Adults ate it without comment because meat was meat, and complaining felt ungrateful. Dehydrated eggs in cardboard tubes. Fresh eggs were another casualty of wartime rationing. Farms sent most of their production to military kitchens, leaving civilian families scrambling for alternatives. The solution came in cardboard tubes or tins filled with powdered eggs. Dehydrated, shelf-stable, and capable of lasting months without refrigeration. On paper, they were perfect. In practice, they were tolerated at best. Your grandmother would open a tube and pour out pale yellow powder, fine as dust. The instructions said to whisk it with water until it resembled beaten eggs. She would stir and stir, watching the powder slowly hydrate into something thick and slightly lumpy. It never looked quite right, never smelled quite right, but she poured it into a hot skillet anyway. The scrambled eggs that resulted were dry, chalky, and faintly metallic. They did not fluff up like real eggs. They clumped together in rubbery chunks that stuck to your teeth. Children grimaced but ate them anyway, washing each bite down with milk or juice. Adults added butter, salt, pepper, anything to improve the flavor. Some families mixed the powder into cake batter or cookie dough, where the strange texture mattered less. Government pamphlets promoted powdered eggs as scientifically advanced, a marvel of modern food preservation. Advertisements showed smiling homemakers serving them confidently, as if they were indistinguishable from fresh. But nobody was fooled. Powdered eggs were a compromise, a way to get protein when real eggs were unavailable. Liver spread in a tin organ meats were cheap, plentiful, and packed with protein. Liver was one of the most common, sold fresh in butcher shops or processed into spreadable pastes and packed into tins. Liver spread became a pantry staple in the 1940s. marketed as nutritious, economical, and easy to use. For families watching every penny, it was an affordable way to get meat on the table. The tin was small, about the size of a tuna can, with a key attached to peel back the lid. Inside was a dense, brownish paste with a strong metallic smell. Your grandmother would scrape it out with a knife and spread it on white bread, sometimes adding mustard or pickles to cut through the intensity. The taste was rich, almost overwhelming, with a mineral quality that coated your tongue. Children hated it. The flavor was too strong, too adult, too unlike anything they wanted to eat. But adults, especially those who had grown up during the Depression, swore by it. They said it gave you energy, built up your blood, kept you healthy through hard winters. Some immigrant families already had traditions of eating liver pâté, so the tinned version felt familiar rather than strange. Liver spread sandwiches became common in school lunchboxes, though kids often tried to trade them away. The smell alone gave them away, pungent and unmistakable. But in homes where meat was scarce, liver spread stretched the grocery budget further than almost anything else. Canned spaghetti sandwich filler. This one sounds insane to modern ears, but in the 1940s, canned spaghetti as a sandwich filler was completely normal. Companies sold spaghetti and tomato sauce packed into small cans that could be opened cold and eaten straight from the tin. And families, looking for ways to make cheap food stretch even further, started using it as sandwich filling. Picture your grandmother opening a can of cold spaghetti, draining some of the sauce, and spooning the pasta onto white bread. She would fold it over and hand it to you, and somehow children in the 1940s ate it without question. The bread would get soggy from the sauce, the noodles would slip out the sides, but it was filling. It was easy, and it used ingredients that were always available. Taste was sweet, tangy, and strangely satisfying if you grew up with it. The canned spaghetti had a soft, almost mushy texture from sitting in sauce, and the bread absorbed the flavors. Some families added a slice of cheese or a sprinkle of salt. Others ate it plain, treating it like a normal lunch option. Schools sometimes served canned spaghetti sandwiches in cafeterias, and children traded them like currency. If you had one, you could swap for crackers, an apple, or a cookie. It was not considered weird at the time. It was just food, another way to make a meal out of whatever was affordable and shelf-stable. Potato bread stretch, loaves. Flour was rationed during the war, which meant bakers had to find ways to make bread without using as much wheat. The solution was potato bread. By mixing mashed potatoes into the dough, bakers could stretch flour further, creating loaves that were heavier, denser, and lasted longer than regular white bread. Your grandmother might have made it herself, boiling potatoes until soft, mashing them smooth, and then folding them into flour, yeast, and water. The dough was thick and sticky, hard to knead, but it rose slowly in a warm corner of the kitchen. When baked, the loaves came out golden brown with a heavy, compact crumb. The texture was different from regular bread. It was moist, almost gummy, and had a subtle earthy flavor from the potatoes. Slices were thick and substantial, one piece filling you up more than 2 slices of regular bread. Some people loved it, saying it stayed fresh longer and made better toast. Others found it too heavy, too dense, like chewing through a sponge. But potato bread was practical. It used ingredients that were easy to grow in victory gardens, and it did not require as many ration stamps. Families served it with every meal, using it to soak up stews, make sandwiches, or eat plain with margarine. It was filling, affordable, and kept families fed when wheat was scarce. After the war, potato bread became less common. White bread returned to bakeries, soft and fluffy the way people remembered, but potato bread never fully disappeared. Some bakeries still make it today, marketed as artisan or old-fashioned. But in the 1940s, it was not artisan, it was necessity, a way to bake bread when flour was precious and every crumb mattered. Victory. Garden canned beets. Victory gardens were everywhere during the 1940s. Families turned backyards, vacant lots, and even parks into vegetable plots, growing food to ease the strain on rationed supplies. Beets were one of the easiest crops to grow, hardy and productive even in poor soil. And once harvested, they were canned in batches, jarred with vinegar and sugar, and stored in cellars for winter. Every grandmother seemed to have a shelf full of canned beets. Dark purple jars lined up in rows, labeled with masking tape and dates written in pencil. Opening a jar meant releasing a sharp, tangy smell that filled the kitchen. Every grandmother seemed to have a shelf full of canned beets. Dark purple jars lined up in rows, labeled with masking tape and dates written in pencil. Opening a jar meant releasing a sharp, tangy smell that filled the kitchen. The beets inside were soft, almost slimy, stained deep red from their own juice. You either loved them or hated them. There was no middle ground. Some people ate them straight from the jar, forking out slices and savoring the sweet-sour flavor. Others could barely stand the smell, holding their noses and pushing the beets to the side of their plates. Families served them anyway because they were nutritious, filling, and homegrown. Canned beets showed up at every holiday meal, sliced and arranged on plates beside turkey or ham. They were mixed into salads, served cold with mayonnaise, or eaten as a side dish with bread. Children joked that they stained everything they touched, turning fingers and mouths purple. After the war, victory gardens became less common, and commercial canned beets took over. But for those who grew up eating Grandma's homemade pickled beets, store-bought versions never tasted quite the same. The memory of those dark purple jars remained, a symbol of self-sufficiency and the determination to grow food when grocery stores could not keep up. Powdered milk. Powdered milk was a staple in almost every 1940s household. Fresh milk was rationed and hard to keep without reliable refrigeration. So families turned to powdered milk, sold in large cans or cardboard boxes, shelf-stable for months. Just add water, stir, and you had something that resembled milk, sort of. Your grandmother would scoop the powder into a pitcher, add cold water, and whisk until it dissolved. The liquid that resulted was pale, thin, and slightly chalky. It did not taste like fresh milk. It lacked the creamy richness, the subtle sweetness, the smooth texture. But it was milk, at least in name, and it provided calcium and protein. Children complained endlessly. They could taste the difference immediately, especially if they drank it plain. So mothers learned tricks. They added a little sugar or vanilla to mask the flavor. They used it in cooking, where the off-taste was less noticeable. Oatmeal, mashed potatoes, cakes, all made with powdered milk mixed into recipes. Some families never bought fresh milk during the entire war. Powdered milk was cheaper, easier to store, and never spoiled unexpectedly. It became the default, the normal, until a generation of children grew up thinking that was just how milk tasted. After the war, fresh milk returned to fridges, and powdered milk became less common, but it never fully disappeared. It remained a camping staple, an emergency backup, something stored in pantries just in case. And for those who grew up drinking it daily, the taste stayed in memory, not fondly, but unforgettably. A reminder that even the most basic comforts could be taken away and replaced with something that worked, even if it never felt quite right. Pickled pig's feet. Walk into a rural kitchen or corner store in the 1940s, and you might see a large jar sitting on the counter. Inside, floating in cloudy brine, were pickled pig's feet, pale, rubbery, and unmistakable. This was not food for the squeamish. It was food for people who knew how to use every part of an animal and were not about to waste anything. Pig's feet were cheap, often given away by butchers or sold for pennies. Your grandmother would boil them for hours until the meat turned soft and gelatinous, then pack them into jars with vinegar, salt, and spices. The result was tangy, chewy, and strange. You ate them cold, pulling the meat off with your teeth, gnawing through the rubbery skin and cartilage. The flavor was intense, salty and sour, with a hint of pork underneath. Some people loved them, treating them like a delicacy. Others could barely stomach the texture, the way the skin slipped between your teeth, the way the bones and tendons required careful navigation. But in homes where meat was scarce, pickled pig's feet provided protein, collagen, and something to chew on when nothing else was available. Children watched in fascination and horror as grandparents ate them, pulling apart the joints and sucking on the bones. It looked medieval, primitive, but it was practical. Nothing wasted, nothing thrown away. Even the leftover brine was sometimes used in soups or stews, adding flavor and saltiness. After the war, pickled pig's feet became less common, though they never fully disappeared. You can still find them in some stores today, usually in the South or in communities with strong traditional food cultures. But for most Americans, they are a relic of a harder time, a food that made sense during scarcity but feels unnecessary now. Fatback slices. Bacon was expensive during the 1940s, rationed and often unavailable. So families turned to fatback, thick slices of salt-cured pork fat that cost a fraction of the price. It was not bacon. There was almost no meat on it, just layers of white fat with maybe a thin streak of pink. But it was pork, it was salty, and when fried, it turned crispy and filled the kitchen with a rich, savory smell. Your grandmother kept fatback in the pantry, wrapped in paper and stored in a cool place. She would slice it thin and fry it in a cast-iron skillet until it rendered into crackling pieces. The fat that melted off was saved, poured into jars, and used for cooking everything else. Potatoes, beans, cornbread, all fried in fatback grease. The crispy pieces were eaten like chips, sprinkled with salt, and eaten plain or crumbled over vegetables. They were chewy, intensely salty, and satisfying in a way that only pure fat could be. Some people fried them until they were hard as jerky, then chewed them slowly, savoring the flavor. Fatback was not considered poor food at the time. It was just food, a staple that appeared on tables across rural America. Children grew up eating it without thinking twice, associating the smell of frying fatback with home and comfort. It was only later, as processed bacon became cheap and widely available, that fatback started to feel like a relic of harder times. After the war, fatback remained common in Southern cooking, used to flavor greens, beans, and stews. But in most of the country, it faded from everyday use. People wanted meat, not just fat, but for those who grew up with it, the taste and smell of fatback stayed in memory, tied to kitchens where nothing was wasted and every ingredient served a purpose. Home-churned butter with salt crystals. Store-bought butter was rationed, but if you lived in the country or knew someone with a cow, you could make your own. Home-churned butter was a labor of love, a process that took time, patience, and strong arms. Your grandmother would pour fresh cream into a wooden churn, and then someone, usually a child, would pump the paddle up and down for what felt like hours. At first, nothing happened. The cream sloshed around, looking the same. But gradually it began to thicken. The sloshing turned to a heavier, rhythmic thumping as the butterfat separated from the liquid. Finally, golden chunks of butter emerged, floating in thin buttermilk. Your grandmother would scoop them out, press them together, and work out the excess liquid. The butter was pale yellow, flecked with tiny salt crystals she added by hand. It was rich, creamy, and tasted nothing like store-bought. You could taste the grass the cow had eaten, the freshness of the cream, the work that went into making it. Spread on warm bread, it melted into soft crumbs, buttery and satisfying. Home-churned butter was not just food, it was pride. Families who made their own butter felt self-sufficient, less dependent on ration stamps and store shelves. They shared it with neighbors, gave it as gifts, and served it at special meals. The ritual of churning became a shared memory, something children remembered doing on summer afternoons while Grandma supervised. After the war, Fewer families made their own butter. Commercial production improved. And buying butter became easier than churning it. But the memory of home-churned butter stayed vivid, tied to a time when making your own food was not a hobby, but a necessity. Bread wrapped in wax paper. Plastic wrap did not exist in the 1940s. Bread came wrapped in wax paper, thin sheets that crinkled when you touched them. Bakeries folded each loaf carefully, sometimes adding a handwritten date in pencil on the outside. There were no expiration dates, no preservatives to keep bread soft for weeks. You bought bread, ate it quickly, and if it started to mold, you cut off the bad parts and ate the rest. Your grandmother treated bread like it was precious. She kept it in a bread box on the counter, checking it daily for freshness. If it went stale, she turned it into breadcrumbs, stuffing, or bread pudding. Nothing was wasted. Moldy slices were trimmed and toasted. Hard crusts were dunked in soup or milk until soft again. The wax paper wrapping served another purpose. Once the bread was gone, the paper was saved. It was reused to wrap sandwiches, line cake pans, or cover leftovers. Families folded and smoothed the paper, extending its life as long as possible. Throwing it away after one use felt wasteful. Bread wrapped in wax paper had a different texture than modern bread. It dried out faster, developed a firmer crust, and had a shorter shelf life, but it tasted better, more natural, without the chemical aftertaste of preservatives. You could smell the yeast, taste the flour, feel the difference between bread made fresh that morning and bread made days ago. After the war, plastic wrap and preservatives changed bread forever. Loaves stayed soft for weeks, wrapped in plastic that never crinkled or tore, but something was lost. The ritual of checking bread, trimming mold, and using every last crumb disappeared. Bread became disposable, and the generation that grew up with wax paper never stopped noticing the difference. Honey-preserved apple rings. Apples were plentiful in many parts of the country, and families who had apple trees found creative ways to preserve the harvest. One method was honey-preserved apple rings. Your grandmother would peel apples, slice them into rings, and boil them in honey until they soaked up the sweetness. Then she would string them on twine and hang them to dry in the kitchen or on the porch. The rings dried slowly, turning leathery and golden, hanging like little halos from the ceiling. Children reached up and pulled them down for snacks, chewy and intensely sweet. The honey preserved them, preventing mold and keeping them edible for months. They were better than candy, natural and satisfying, with a texture that required slow chewing. Honey-preserved apple rings appeared at holiday tables, arranged on plates as dessert. They were added to oatmeal, baked into pies, or eaten plain with tea. The process of making them became a fall ritual, something families did together while apples were in season. The smell of apples boiling in honey filled the house with warmth, a scent tied to comfort and abundance. Even in the middle of winter, those dried rings reminded families that summer had existed and would come again. They were food, yes, but also memory, tied to orchards, harvests, and the work of preserving what you had. After the war, as canned and frozen fruits became more common, fewer families made honey-preserved apple rings. It was easier to buy applesauce or dried fruit from the store, but for those who grew up pulling golden rings from strings, the memory stayed sweet, tied to kitchens where food was made by hand, and nothing from the harvest was wasted. Homemade horseradish in glass jars. Homemade horseradish was not for the faint of heart. Your grandmother would dig up horseradish roots from the garden, thick and gnarled, and then the real work began. She would peel and shred them by hand, grating the root into fine pieces. The process released fumes so strong they cleared sinuses, brought tears to eyes, and made everyone in the kitchen cough and gasp. But the result was worth it. Freshly grated horseradish, mixed with vinegar and a little salt, was packed into glass jars and stored on the cold shelf near the milk. The flavor was sharp, fiery, and immediate. A tiny spoonful was enough to wake up your entire mouth, burning your tongue and sinuses in the best possible way. Horseradish was served with roast beef, mixed into sauces, or spread on sandwiches for anyone brave enough. It was not something children liked, but adults appreciated its intensity. A little horseradish turned a plain meal into something memorable, adding heat and complexity. The jars sat in the pantry, their contents slowly mellowing over time. Fresh horseradish was the strongest, almost unbearable in its intensity. As it aged, the heat softened, becoming more manageable but still powerful. Families used it sparingly, knowing that a little went a long way. After the war, prepared horseradish became available in stores, milder and more convenient than homemade. But for those who grew up with the real thing, store-bought versions felt weak, watered down, missing the punch that made horseradish special. Homemade horseradish was dangerous, overwhelming, and unforgettable. Sweet pickled watermelon rind. Nothing was wasted in the 1940s, not even the parts of food most people today throw away. Watermelon rind, the thick white flesh between the red fruit and the green skin, was turned into pickles. Your grandmother would cut away the green outer skin, slice the white rind into chunks, and boil them with sugar, vinegar, and spices until they turned translucent and sweet. The result was strange but addictive. Sweet pickled watermelon rind had a crisp texture, somewhere between a pickle and a candy. The flavor was tangy and sweet at the same time, with hints of cinnamon and cloves. Some people loved them, eating them straight from the jar. Others found them too odd, too unlike anything else, but they served a purpose. In a time when food could not be wasted, finding a use for watermelon rind made sense. It turned something destined for the compost into a treat that lasted through winter. The jars lined up on pantry shelves, proof that creativity could stretch food further than anyone expected. Sweet pickled watermelon rind appeared at church suppers, holiday tables, and family gatherings. They were conversation starters, something unusual enough to spark questions. Children tried them cautiously, unsure whether they were dessert or side dish. Adults ate them confidently, remembering when making them was not about being creative, but about not wasting food. After the war, as abundance returned, fewer people bothered with watermelon rind pickles. It was easier to throw the rind away and buy something else. But for those who grew up eating them, the memory lingered, a reminder that even the parts we discard can become something worth keeping. Cornmeal mush blocks. Cornmeal mush was depression food that carried over into the 1940s, cheap and filling when budgets were tight. Your grandmother would cook cornmeal with water and salt until it thickened into a porridge, then pour it into loaf pans to cool overnight. By morning, it had solidified into a firm block that could be sliced like bread. The slices were fried in a hot skillet, turning golden and crispy on the outside while staying soft inside. Served with margarine, syrup, or even gravy, cornmeal mush became breakfast, lunch, or dinner, depending on what else was available. It was bland, simple, and required almost no ingredients beyond cornmeal and water. Children ate it without enthusiasm. It was filling but not exciting, something you ate because it was there, not because you wanted it. But adults appreciated its practicality. One pot of cornmeal could feed a family for days, stretched across multiple meals. Some families served it sweet, with molasses or honey. Others served it savory, with cheese or sausage gravy. The texture was dense and chewy, almost gummy, but it stuck to your ribs and kept hunger at bay. After the war, cornmeal mush became less common. Ration stamp meat. Combos meat. Rationing during World War II forced butchers to get creative. With limited supplies of beef and pork, they started mixing different meats together, creating patties and loaves from whatever was available. These were called ration stamp meat combos, blends of beef, pork, organ meats, and sometimes even lamb or veal, all ground together and formed into something sellable. Your grandmother would bring home a package wrapped in paper, not entirely sure what was inside. The butcher might say it was mostly beef with a little pork and maybe some liver mixed in. She would cook it anyway, forming it into meatloaf or frying it as patties. The flavor was unpredictable, sometimes rich and beefy, other times carrying the metallic tang of organ meat. These meat combos were not labeled clearly. There were no ingredient lists, no percentages, just the butcher's word and whatever could be stretched from limited stock. Some batches were better than others. You learned to add plenty of seasoning, onions, and breadcrumbs to mask whatever odd flavors might emerge. Children ate them without knowing what they contained. If it looked like meat and tasted somewhat like meat, that was enough. Parents served them proudly, grateful to have any meat at all when ration stamps limited purchases to just a pound or two per week. The practice stopped almost immediately after the war ended. Butchers went back to selling clearly labeled cuts, and families could choose exactly what they wanted. But those mystery meat combos remained in memory, a reminder of when you ate what you could get and asked fewer questions. Burnt sugar syrup bottles. Molasses was expensive and maple syrup even more so. So families made their own sweetener by burning sugar. Your grandmother would heat white or brown sugar in a heavy pot, stirring constantly as it melted and darkened. The kitchen filled with smoke and the sharp smell of caramelizing sugar. Too little heat and nothing happened. Too much, and it burned bitter and unusable. But when done right, burnt sugar syrup was magic. Dark, thick, and intensely sweet with a slightly bitter edge. She would pour it into bottles while still warm, sealing them tight and storing them in the pantry. This syrup went on pancakes, into oatmeal, and even into homemade cola when mixed with carbonated water. The flavor was complex, nothing like store-bought syrups. It had depth, a smoky sweetness that tasted almost like candy. Some batches turned out perfectly balanced. Others were too bitter or too thin, but they were used anyway because sugar was too precious to waste. Making burnt sugar syrup was risky. The hot sugar could splatter and burn skin. The pot could scorch and ruin. But for families looking to stretch their grocery budget, it was worth the effort. One batch could last weeks, sweetening breakfast and desserts without using up ration stamps. After the war, commercial syrups became cheap and plentiful. Burnt sugar syrup became unnecessary, a practice that faded as quickly as rationing ended. But for those who made it or watched their grandmothers make it, the smell and taste stayed in memory. A reminder of when even sweetness required work and risk. Canned brown bread. Canned brown bread sounds impossible until you see it. Sold in tall cylindrical cans, this dense, molasses-heavy bread slid out in perfect rings when opened. It was especially popular in New England, where it became a Saturday night tradition served with baked beans. Your grandmother would open both ends of the can, push the bread through, and slice it into thick rounds. The texture was dense and moist, almost cake-like, dark brown from molasses and whole wheat flour. It had a sweet, earthy flavor that paired perfectly with savory dishes. The bread required no baking, no rising, no work beyond opening a can. During wartime rationing, when flour was limited and ovens needed to conserve fuel, canned brown bread offered convenience. You could store it for months, pull it out whenever needed, and serve it without preparation. Children found it strange at first, bread from a can seeming unnatural, but the taste won them over. Spread with butter or cream cheese, it became a treat. Toasted and served with eggs, it was hearty breakfast food. The molasses gave it depth, a richness that regular bread lacked. After the war, canned brown bread stuck around longer than most rationing foods. You can still find it today in some grocery stores, usually near the baked beans. But it is a regional specialty now. not the national staple it once was. For those who grew up with it, canned brown bread was normal, even comforting, a reminder that convenience and tradition could come in the strangest packages. Apple cider vinegar jelly. This one sounds bizarre because it was. Apple cider vinegar jelly was made from vinegar, sugar, and gelatin, molded into shapes and served at Sunday dinners. The idea was to create something tart and refreshing that could accompany roasted meats or be eaten as a palate cleanser between courses. Your grandmother would boil vinegar with sugar until it reduced slightly, then add gelatin and pour it into molds. As it cooled, it set into firm, jiggly shapes. Clear or slightly golden, the jelly wobbled on plates, catching light like amber. The taste was intensely sour with just enough sweetness to keep it from being unpleasant. You ate small amounts, letting the tartness cut through the richness of other foods. Some people loved it, finding it refreshing and unusual. Others could barely swallow it, the vinegar flavor too strong and unexpected. Vinegar jelly appeared at holiday meals, molded into decorative shapes and arranged on serving platters. It looked elegant, like something from a fancy restaurant, but the taste always surprised guests who expected something sweet and got vinegar instead. After the war, as more ingredients became available, vinegar jelly fell out of fashion. People wanted real fruit jellies, sweet and familiar. But for a generation that made it and served it, vinegar jelly represented creativity under constraint. Finding ways to make special meals out of basic pantry staples. Dry yeast cakes in wax packs. Before yeast came in convenient little packets, it came in cakes, compressed blocks of live yeast wrapped in wax paper and kept cold. Your grandmother stored them in the icebox, checking them regularly to make sure they were still fresh. If they dried out or got too warm, they died, and bread would not rise. Using yeast cakes required knowledge. You had to proof them first, crumbling a piece into warm water with a pinch of sugar and waiting to see if it bubbled. If nothing happened, the yeast was dead and you needed to start over. If it foamed and grew, it was alive and ready to make bread. The smell of proofing yeast was unmistakable, earthy and slightly sour. It filled the kitchen with promise, the assurance that bread was coming. Children watched the process with fascination, seeing something living work its way through dough, making it rise and transform. Yeast cakes were temperamental. Too much heat killed them. Too little, and they worked slowly. Humidity affected them. Air temperature mattered. Your grandmother blamed the weather when bread did not rise, but just as often she blamed herself for not keeping the yeast fresh enough. After the war, dried yeast in packets became standard. It was easier to store, lasted longer, and worked more reliably. Yeast cakes became obsolete, remembered only by those who had learned to bake with them. But for that generation, baking with yeast cakes was part of the craft, a skill that required attention and experience. Sorghum syrup tins. Before maple syrup became affordable, families in many parts of the country used sorghum syrup. Made from sorghum cane, it was dark, thick, and intensely sweet with a slightly bitter edge. Your grandmother kept it in tins, pouring it carefully because it was sticky enough to make a mess. Sorghum syrup went on pancakes, cornbread, and biscuits. It was mixed into cookies and cakes, adding moisture and deep sweetness. The flavor was complex, not as clean as maple, but more interesting, with notes of molasses and something almost earthy. Some people loved it, preferring it to any other sweetener. Others found it too strong, too heavy, overwhelming other flavors. But during rationing, when maple syrup was expensive and sugar limited, sorghum was available and affordable, the syrup was so thick it barely poured in cold weather. Your grandmother would warm the tin near the stove, loosening it enough to drizzle. Children learned to be patient, waiting for the slow stream of dark syrup to finally reach their plates. After the war, as maple syrup production increased and prices dropped, sorghum syrup became less common. It remained popular in the South, where it was part of traditional cooking, but elsewhere it faded. For those who grew up with it, the taste was unmistakable, tied to mornings when breakfast was simple, but sweetened with something that felt homemade and real. White tinned pudding. The final item is one of the strangest, military surplus tinned pudding that made its way into civilian homes. These were desserts packed into war tins, designed to last for years in military supply chains. Chocolate, plum, or tapioca pudding sealed in metal, shelf-stable for what seemed like forever. After the war, surplus stores sold these tins cheap, and families bought them as emergency desserts. Your grandmother might have kept a few in the back of the pantry, saved for when nothing else was available. Opening one meant using a can opener to cut around the lid, then scooping out dense, heavy pudding that barely resembled homemade. The texture was thick, almost paste-like, and the flavor was muted, as if all the life had been cooked out of it. Chocolate pudding tasted vaguely of cocoa, but mostly of metal. Tapioca was gummy and strange. Plum pudding was dense and barely sweet, but children ate it anyway, spooning it into bowls and pretending it was a treat. After years of rationing, even bad pudding felt special. The fact that it came from military supplies made it more interesting, a tangible connection to the war effort. These tins lasted well into the 1950s, sitting on store shelves until they finally sold out. By then, fresh desserts and modern pudding mixes had replaced them. But for those who ate tinned war pudding, the memory stayed. A reminder that convenience and preservation often came at the cost of flavor, and that survival food, no matter how long it lasted, never quite tasted like the real thing. Home-canned cow tongue, if you thought pickled pig's feet were strange. Home-canned cow tongue took it even further. Your grandmother would buy a whole tongue from the butcher, boil it for hours until tender, then peel away the rough outer skin to reveal the pale meat underneath. She would slice it carefully and pack it into mason jars with brine, sealing them tight and storing them in the dark cellar. The jars were labeled with masking tape, grandmother's handwriting marking the date in pencil. They sat on shelves alongside pickles and preserves, looking innocent until you read the label. Cow tongue, served cold, sliced thin, and arranged on plates like deli meat. The texture was dense and smooth, unlike any other meat. The flavor was mild, almost sweet, with none of the gaminess you might expect from organ meat. Your grandmother served it with mustard or horseradish, treating it like a delicacy, and in a way, it was. Tongue was cheap but required skill to prepare properly, and canning it meant protein available year-round. Children reacted with horror when they learned what they were eating. The idea of eating tongue seemed cannibalistic, wrong somehow. But adults who had grown up during the Depression saw it differently. It was meat that cost almost nothing, prepared by someone who knew what they were doing, preserved for times when fresh meat was impossible to find. After the war, fewer families bothered with canning tongue. Fresh meat became available, and the labor of preparing and canning organ meats felt unnecessary. But for those who grew up eating cold sliced tongue from mason jars, the memory remained vivid. Proof that nothing edible went to waste, and that skill could transform even the strangest cuts into something worth eating. Gelatin-dipped fruit. Salads. The 1940s had a strange obsession with gelatin, and nowhere was this more evident than in gelatin-dipped fruit salads. Your grandmother would prepare fresh fruit, grapes, apple slices, sometimes marshmallows, and dip each piece into flavored gelatin before arranging them in a mold. As the gelatin set, the fruit became trapped in a clear dome that jiggled when moved. These creations were considered elegant, sophisticated, the height of modern cooking. Magazines featured them in full-color spreads showing glossy gelatin molds with fruit suspended inside like specimens in amber. Your grandmother would unmold them onto lettuce leaves, serving them proudly at Sunday dinners and church potlucks. The taste was confusing. Sweet fruit mixed with savory lettuce, everything coated in wobbly gelatin that had a chemical, artificial flavor. Children poked at them with forks, watching them quiver, unsure whether they were eating dessert or salad. Adults ate them politely, complimenting the presentation, even when the combination of flavors made no sense. The effort required was significant. Each piece of fruit had to be dipped individually, the gelatin kept at just the right temperature so it coated but did not melt. The mold had to be perfect, no air bubbles, no imperfections. And the result, while visually impressive, was more about appearance than taste. After the war, gelatin salads remained popular for another decade, but gradually fell out of fashion. By the 1960s, they seemed dated, old-fashioned, trying too hard. But in the 1940s, they represented modernity, science in the kitchen, proof that food could be art. Strange, jiggly, confusing art that nobody really enjoyed, but everyone felt obligated to make. Chicory coffee substitutes. We mentioned Victory coffee earlier, but chicory deserves its own recognition. Especially in the South, chicory coffee was not just a wartime substitute, but a tradition that outlasted rationing. Made from roasted chicory root, it was darker, more bitter, and earthier than regular coffee, but for families in Louisiana and surrounding areas it was preferred. Your grandmother would brew it strong, the liquid coming out almost black, thick enough to seem substantial. Mixed with hot milk, it became café au lait, a breakfast tradition that required no real coffee beans at all. The flavor was intense, smoky and bitter, with undertones that tasted almost like chocolate if you convinced yourself hard enough. During wartime, chicory coffee spread beyond the South as coffee became impossible to find. Families everywhere tried it, most hating it at first, some learning to tolerate it, a few actually acquiring a taste for it. It was cheaper than real coffee, grew locally in some regions, and stretched coffee supplies when even a little real coffee could be mixed in. The ritual of drinking it mattered more than the taste. Sitting down with a hot cup, even if it was not real coffee, provided comfort and routine in uncertain times. Your grandmother might have hated the flavor, but loved the moment, the warmth of the cup in her hands, the steam rising, the feeling that some things stayed normal even when everything else had changed. After the war, chicory coffee became harder to find outside the South. Most Americans returned to real coffee gladly, never looking back. But in New Orleans and nearby areas, chicory coffee remained, still served today in restaurants and homes. A reminder that some substitutes, given enough time and tradition, become the real thing in their own right. Crisco-fried oatmeal patties. Depression-era cooking techniques carried over into the 1940s, and Crisco-fried oatmeal patties were a perfect example. Your grandmother would take leftover oatmeal from breakfast, cold and congealed, and mix it with a little flour and salt. She would form it into patties and fry them in Crisco until golden and crispy on the outside. The result was strange but satisfying. Crispy edges surrounding a soft, slightly chewy interior that tasted like toasted oat. They were not quite pancakes, not quite fritters, but something in between. Served with syrup or jam, they became a second breakfast or afternoon snack. Eaten plain with salt, they were a side dish for dinner. The practice came from a simple rule: nothing gets thrown away. Leftover oatmeal that nobody wanted to eat, reheated, became something entirely different when fried. It transformed from boring mush into something with texture and flavor. flavor, something worth eating. Children ate them without questioning where they came from. They tasted good, especially when fried crispy, and that was enough. Adults appreciated the resourcefulness, the way a pot of oatmeal could stretch across multiple meals in different forms. After the war, as food became more plentiful and leftovers less precious, fewer families bothered frying oatmeal patties. It was easier to make fresh food than repurpose old, but for those who grew up eating them, the memory stayed. A reminder that creativity in the kitchen came from necessity, and that even the most basic leftovers could become something worth making again. Saltine milk soup. Final item is perhaps the simplest and most humble of all. Saltine milk soup. Your grandmother would crush saltine crackers into a bowl, pour warm milk over them, add a pat of butter and a sprinkle of pepper, and call it a meal. It sounds like desperation food, and in many ways it was. But it was also comforting, warm and filling when nothing else was available. Crackers would soften in the milk, absorbing the liquid until they became thick and porridge-like. Butter melted on top, adding richness. Pepper gave it a little bite, a hint of flavor in an otherwise bland dish. You ate it slowly, spooning up the soft crackers and warm milk, letting it fill your stomach and warm you from the inside. This was food for sick days, cold nights, for times when the cupboard was almost bare. It required almost no ingredients, nothing that had to be rationed or saved. Saltines were cheap and lasted forever. Milk was something most families had. Butter and pepper were pantry staples. Children ate saltine milk soup when they had upset stomachs or could not keep anything else down. The blandness was soothing, easy to digest. Adults ate it when there was nothing else, when payday was still days away and the pantry was down to basics. It was not something you served to guests or bragged about making. It was private food, survival food, the kind of meal you ate alone and never mentioned. After the war, saltine milk soup faded from most tables. People wanted real meals, proper dinners, food that felt like abundance. But for those who had eaten it, the memory remained. Not as something delicious or missed, but as a reminder of how little you needed to survive and how even the simplest combination could provide comfort when nothing else was available. 30 grocery items. 30 reminders of a time when making do was not a choice but a way of life. Our grandparents lived through years when creativity meant survival, when turning organ meats into dinner and leftover oatmeal into patties was not about being clever but about feeding your family with what you had. These items disappeared not because people forgot them, but because they no longer had to remember. When abundance returned, when grocery shelves filled with fresh food and options, families gratefully moved on. They left behind the powdered eggs, the margarine with dye packets, the saltine milk soup. They chose fresh over preserved, real over substitute, plenty over scarcity. But in leaving these foods behind, they took the lessons with them. The knowledge that waste is wrong, that creativity matters, that family gets fed no matter what it takes. These 30 items were not just grocery products. They were teachers, showing a generation how to survive and a generation after that what survival looked like. So tell us in the comments, which of these 30 items from the 1940s would you never dare try? Which ones surprised you? Which ones did your own grandparents make? Hit that like button if you enjoyed this journey through grocery history, and subscribe so you never miss our next deep dive into the foods and traditions that shaped the generations before us. Because understanding where we came from helps us appreciate what we have now. And remembering the sacrifices our grandparents made reminds us that abundance is never guaranteed, but resourcefulness never goes out of style.